As we continue to examine the impact of the Biden-Harris administration's border crisis, an often overlooked casualty of their open border policy is how the influx of migrants have overwhelmed many local school districts. Now, earlier this month, Reuters reported that more than 500,000 school-age migrant children have arrived in the U.S. since 2022. And according to a 2023 study, taxpayers in Texas alone spend more than $7 billion annually on education for illegal migrants, leading an already struggling school districts to deal with the federal government's problems. And these are low estimates. It could be over 1 million of these students that are in the country. And with a national average of over $15,000 per student, local governments are saying, hey, wait a minute, enough of this. So joining me now to discuss this is Andrew Arthur. He is the resident fellow in law and policy at the Center for Immigration Studies, who recently released a study on this particular issue. Andrew, welcome to Washington Watch.
Thank you so much for having me, Tony.
So Andrew, walk us through the numbers on migrant children now in our education system and what this is costing taxpayers. And you know, a lot of people think the federal government pays a lot of education. They pay just a fraction. This is coming out of the pockets of local communities.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Reuters report was based upon a report that was purportedly done by Syracuse University, which generally is the transactional records access clearinghouse that Syracuse would track. But I couldn't find it, so I went back and I looked at the numbers myself. We're talking about more than 300,000 unaccompanied alien children who have been released to sponsors in the United States. And then, you know, we are potentially talking about another 700,000 children that came with parents in what we call family units, which is why, you know, in the estimate that I did, I said that the actual number is somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million brand new migrant children who have entered the United States since 2022, you know, just over the southwest border. So we're talking about a huge number of people. Nearly all of those children speak some other language than English. In fact, it's doubtful that many of them have any fluency in English at all. Most of them have suffered from poor levels of education prior to the point that they've gotten to the United States, and now they're flowing into our public school system. And you mentioned the number, it's about an average of $15,000 per pupil. And when you talk about English as a second language learners, you can add about 20% to that, or, you know, $3,000 for a total of $18,000 per student. And as you mentioned before, Washington doesn't really pay much of the funding for the public schools in the United States at all. Most of that funding comes from ad valorem taxes, property taxes, that all of us who own property in the United States pay. We know that about $800 billion in local tax money is paid for public schools nationwide annually, and that equals out to about the $800 billion in property taxes that localities receive. Now, again, some of those school districts receive state money, but, you know, nearly all of the costs of these migrant children are being foisted by Washington onto the states and localities.
So a couple of questions, Andrew. First off, they're required to take these students based upon this 1982 Supreme Court decision, which is why some states are preparing to try to challenge that court decision because of the vast volume of minors, illegal minors that have come into this country. Now, in your piece, you kind of put this into context because we're talking about if we're upwards of 1 million. Help people grasp how significant of a volume that is when we consider the number of kids in public education.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a huge number of kids, especially given the two factors that I mentioned before. One, most of them don't speak English when they come here, which means that these schools have to hire English as a second language learners. They have to, you know, find textbooks that are in these kids' languages. They have to make special accommodations for these children, and they have to expand their physical plant just so that there are, you know, desks for these kids to sit at. And, then when you consider the fact that most of these kids, haven't had the benefits of a good education up to this point, there's a lot of remedial education, Tony, that takes place trying to mainstream these students into the system. Now, you and I both know public school teachers and public school administrators are going to move heaven and earth for any kid that they get. But these kids are going to require a lot of special accommodations, which means that there's going to be less time paid to legal resident kids who speak English and United States citizen kids who have been raised in the language. So, yeah, I mean, all across the board, this is a significant impediment that we're placing on our schools and on our school children. And it's one that, Washington, D.C., that the Biden administration seems to be blithely uninterested in addressing.
Schools base their budgets, they look at kind of what they need to do in terms of expanding based upon what's in the pipeline. And they've got a few years to prepare for that when you consider the growth of a community. But when you've got this volume coming in, there's no way to prepare and plan for that.
Yeah, no. And, I've been an expert witness in one case where we've talked about those school costs. And planning is generally done a year, 2 years, 5 years into the future. You'll notice, every now and again, your locality raises property taxes, because they know that they're going to, have those additional costs. There's no way for school districts in this country to anticipate that next year they're going to get another 200 migrant children, because the Biden administration really isn't very forthcoming about telling us how many kids are coming and doesn't do anything at all to accommodate them
Right.
where they land.
And
So,
they
yeah, I
just
mean,
they just drop them onto that school district. And I think as with the growing concern about the impact of illegal immigration, very few communities are going to approve additional property taxes to fund education. This is going to be a crisis. This is a crisis in the making. Andrew, sorry we're out of time, but I appreciate your work on this, and I'm sure we're going to have another conversation at a later date as we continue to track this. Thanks for being with us today.
thank you so much for having me, Tony.